And that hasn't changed at all in the last 40 years. So for folks on the left, particularly in the political class, I think, who assumed that we were moving beyond religion and then saw this very particular kind of religion rise up on the religious right, it was kind of natural for them to react by pushing back and saying religion has no place in politics. And as well with the development of abortion as a key political issue, that kind of cemented their resolve. And within a few years, Democrats had certainly stopped talking to evangelicals. They assumed evangelicals were not their voters, despite the fact that Jimmy Carter was a pretty prominent evangelical Democrat. They assumed, well, they're all Republicans, they're all right-wing, they're certainly all pro-life, and they vote only based on abortion, and we're not going to talk to them. We're going to write them off. The same thing happened with Catholics. In 1988, Michael Dukakis's campaign was the first, but not the last, Democratic campaign to just refuse all invitations from Catholic sites on the assumption that abortion would come up and they didn't know how to deal with it, so it was better not to talk to those folks at all, to, again, write them off. Well, if you write off white evangelicals and you write off Catholics, that's 50% of the electorate right there. And it certainly saves you from having difficult conversations about abortion. But if you're not talking to Catholics, it's not that you're not hearing them on abortion. You're not hearing them on the death penalty, and on immigration, and on healthcare, and on the war. That's a whole class of voters who have things to say, and issues that overlap with your concerns, who you're not even bothering to talk to. This reached kind of a low point, I think it's fair to say, in 2004, with the 2004 election. And I'll get into some of the greatest hits there in just a moment. But what really pushed me from just being kind of interested in this topic, but personally and professionally, to feeling like I had to do some research and tell the story and write this book, was the response that I saw on the left and from my fellow liberals. I used to work in democratic politics after the 2004 campaign, when it was kind of misreported that values voters supposedly decided the election, that these millions and millions of evagelicals just flooded to the polls and decided that abortion and gay marriage were the only issues that mattered to them, and they swung the election for George Bush. That turned out to not actually be the case, but it didn't really matter. That became kind of the scapegoat for a lot of frustrated, and for good reason, frustrated liberals. Many of you may have gotten the email that I got that was circulated very widely after the election that had a map. And the map had the United States of Canada, which included all of Canada and then the two coasts, and oddly Michigan, I have to say, which is my home state and is probably not belonging in the United States of Canada, but I think a lot of people forget and think we actually are part of Canada to begin with. But there was the United States of Canada, and then there was Jesus land in the middle. And that was the perfect kind of stark image of it's us versus them. We have completely different values. There are these stupid people they've had the wool pulled over their eyes by Republicans, and they're voting based on their values, and don't they know that we're better for their economic interests, that if they were really paying attention, they would side with Democrats. That was something I heard over and over and over again. When I speak to Democratic audiences, I definitely hear the stereotypes that come up about evangelicals, and it surprises me because 40% of evangelicals are politically moderate. Now, they don't all vote with Republicans, and I can get into some of the reasons why they've been kind of siding by default with the Republican Party. But 40% of evangelicals are moderate, 10% are liberal, which leaves 50% of evangelicals who roughly line up with what our public idea is of who an evangelical is. But when I talk to liberals, I so often hear the description of an evangelical come back at me that I don't identify with at all. I gave a talk at Palo Alto a couple of months ago, back in the fall, and after I was done, a woman came up and tried very, very hard to convince me that literacy rates had just plummeted since evangelicals had become more prominent in society. which turns out to not be true at all. I was giving a talk on the other coast in Manhattan a few weeks ago, and a man stood up after I was done and said that for Democrats to reach out to religious voters would be the same thing as collaborating with Nazis, which is probably at the far extreme of what liberals think, but it's not unusual. That's not just one person's view, which makes it all the more remarkable that this year's Democratic frontrunners have a very different approach to religious outreach, that they've been much more comfortable talking about their own faith, but that they understand that it's not a matter of just talking Jesus talk, that if you don't mean it, it won't work. It certainly then just smells of pandering. And that shouldn't be a requirement either, that it's not what I like to refer to as kind of biblical Tourette syndrome that we saw after 2004, when Democrats kind of freaked out. They realized they had a problem with religion, and they started just randomly dropping scripture phrases into their speeches on the House floor. Just kind of popping out. Jim Wallace was one of many religious leaders who were getting phone calls from congressional speechwriters trying to get what lines from hymns could we use for speeches, what would be useful. It goes deeper than that. But just to give you a sense of where we've come from before we talk about the 2008 election, let me just read you a little bit about 2004 and about the mistakes that the Kerry campaign made. I think it's fair to say that the Kerry campaign was flawed on a number of different levels. Certainly, religion was not the only problem that John Kerry had. And yet, it's really instructive that all of the mistakes that Democrats had made, the stereotypes they had, and the misconceptions about religion that had developed over 30 years really reached a boiling point in 2004. That year, the Bush-Cheney operation did more with religious outreach than any other campaign in history, deploying a massive parish and congregation level mobilization effort. In Florida alone, the GOP employed a state chairwoman for evangelical outreach, who appointed a dozen regional coordinators around the state, and she designated outreach chairs in each of Florida's 67 counties. Each county chair, in turn, recruited between 30 and 50 volunteers to contact and register their evangelical neighbors. The Kerry campaign, meanwhile, hired one junior staff aide with no national campaign experience to oversee religious outreach, and they allowed her one intern. The two had a single telephone between them with which to recruit and contact volunteers. It didn't take long for religion to become an issue in the campaign. In the spring of 2004, a handful of conservative Catholic bishops began to insist that Kerry, a Roman Catholic, should be denied communion because of his support for abortion rights. A media frenzy, which was quickly dubbed the Wafer Watch, soon metastasized, with journalists following Kerry to Mass each Sunday and doing everything but checking his molars for evidence that he had indeed been given communion. The candidate's senior advisors huddled to discuss strategy. But amazingly, despite the fact that many of Kerry's congressional colleagues had faced just this problem with bishops in recent years, no one had anticipated the problem. It never crossed our minds that this could happen, recalled Christine Stanek, deputy campaign manager. When Kerry and his advisors did reach a decision, it was underwhelming. Ignore the story and hope it goes away. A few surrogates could defend Kerry in the press, but the campaign itself would maintain radio silence. Now, this was the same strategy that they would employ a few months later when the Swift boat attacks began. The flaw in the approach, of course, was that ignoring the situation didn't mean the stories went away. It just ensured that the Kerry campaign forfeited any ability to influence coverage. On one side of the rapidly accumulating media accounts was a handful of conservative bishops whose presence suddenly loomed much larger when left unchallenged. And on the other, the Kerry campaign did not return calls for comment.